there is a mirror in your mind. You've been looking into it your entire life. And every time someone hurt you and you said nothing, swallowed it, called it forgiveness, the mirror cracked just slightly, just enough that you stopped looking at the edges. Because what you saw there was not a saint. It was something you did not have a name for yet. Nietzsche had a name for it. We will get there. But first, stay with the mirror. You know this moment someone says something that lands wrong, a dismissal, a small humiliation dressed as a joke. Your name said with just enough contempt that you felt it in the chest, but could not prove it to anyone who wasn't in the room. And you said, "It's fine. No problem. Don't worry about it." You smiled. Maybe you even meant it, in the way that people mean things when they are exhausted from the alternative. And then you went home, and the thing sat in you like a splinter, too deep to reach, not painful enough to be a crisis. Just present, always just present. This is not a moral failure. This is not weakness in the way people use that word like a verdict handed down from somewhere above. What happened in that moment is mechanical. Your nervous system ran a calculation faster than language. It said, conflict costs more than silence. It said, keep the peace and stay in the group. It said, the pain of swallowing this is less than the pain of what comes after if you don't. And you listened. Because it was right. In the short term, it was always right in the short term. And the short term is all the nervous system has ever been designed to care about. The problem is that you are not a nervous system. You are a person. And persons accumulate. Psychologists call one version of this the Fawn response. Fight, flight, freeze, and then fawn. The fourth reaction to threat. Appease, give, agree, forgive before you have even processed what happened. The nervous system does not distinguish between a physical predator and a person who speaks to you like you're furniture. It only knows threat detected, and it reaches for the tool most likely to make the threat stop for many people. For people who learned early that anger was dangerous, that needs were inconvenient, that being difficult meant being abandoned, the tool is softness. The tool is forgiveness, deployed not from a place of strength, but from a place of calculation. Unconscious, automatic, and over time, corrosive. There is a second mechanism running alongside the first. Researchers call it cognitive dissonance reduction. You have a self-image, I am a good person. Good people forgive. Therefore what I just did, swallowing that, calling it nothing, must be forgiveness, must be virtue. The story writes itself before you have decided anything. And every time you tell it, it becomes more true, more fixed, more load-bearing. Until forgiving is not something you do, it is something you are, because here is what the Fawn response does not account for. The resentment does not disappear, it relocates. This is where most conversations about forgiveness stop. They tell you to forgive for yourself, to release the burden, to choose peace. What they do not tell you is what happens to the thing you did not release, the thing you renamed peace, so you did not have to look at it directly. What they do not tell you is that there is a philosopher who looked at this exact thing, this exact dynamic, in 1887, and what he wrote was not kind. And it was not wrong. Friedrich Nietzsche was living alone in the Swiss Alps when he wrote on the genealogy of morality. He was half blind. He suffered from migraines that lasted for days, from nausea, from a pain in his eyes so severe that reading for more than a few minutes at a time became impossible. He dictated sections. He wrote in short bursts. He was not a comfortable man theorizing from a comfortable chair. He was a man in genuine suffering who had spent years watching people, watching how they talked about virtue and goodness and forgiveness and love, and who had come to suspect that underneath the language of nobility, something else entirely was operating. He called it Ressentiment. a French word for a German idea he could not quite capture otherwise. Not resentment in the ordinary sense, the hot flash of anger that passes, that has somewhere to go. Ressentiment is what happens when the anger has nowhere to go. When a person cannot express what they feel outward, because they lack the power, or the permission, or the nerve, or because the cost is genuinely too high, and so it turns inward and begins to work quietly, systematically. It does not disappear, it transforms. It becomes a court, an internal tribunal running continuously, where you are always the wronged party and they are always convicted, where you replay the moment not to understand it, not to learn from it, but to feel again and again the particular satisfaction of being right, of having suffered, of being good in a world that did not deserve your goodness. Nietzsche saw this and called it what it was, not virtue. Strategy, the only form of power available to someone who has decided, consciously or not, that they have no other kind, the mirror with the cracked edges. This is what lives inside it, not the patient person you perform for the world, but the court, always in session, always ruling in your favor, always waiting for the next case. Nietzsche gave us the instrument, the name, the anatomy, but he did not warn us about what comes next, what happens when you turn the instrument on yourself, when you stop looking at the center of the mirror and start examining the fractures, because the thing you find at the edges is not a victim. It is something harder to hold. And most people, when they get close to it, look away. They go back to the center. They go back to the story about their own patients. But if you stay, if you actually look, here is what is there. The architecture of a person who needs the wound to remain open, not because the pain is enjoyable, because the pain is load-bearing, because a person who has organized their identity around being the one who suffers beautifully, who forgives generously, who absorbs what others cannot. That person needs the suffering to continue in order to remain coherent. A closed wound means there is nothing left to be noble about. Leaving means the suffering was not meaningful. Moving on means they endured it for nothing, and that is a cost the psyche would not pay if it can find any alternative, any reason to stay, any interpretation that keeps the story intact. So they return, not because they cannot leave. They return because leaving would require them to become someone they do not yet know how to be. The mask is not the one you show the world, the patient one, the understanding one, the one that says it's fine with a smile that almost reaches the eyes. The mask is the one underneath, the one that has confused suffering with identity, that has made a home in the pain, because the pain, at least, is familiar. And familiarity is its own kind of safety, a terrible safety. But safety, the illusory reward, is belonging. Every time you forgive someone who has not changed, who will do it again, who is counting on your capacity to absorb, you purchase one thing. You remain acceptable. You remain in the group. You remain the person who does not make things difficult, and the cost is paid in the currency of yourself. Quietly, in installments so small you do not notice until the account is nearly empty, until the mirror is mostly fracture and you are mostly performing the person you thought you were. There is one thing you can do, not a list, not a 12-step program with a certificate at the end, one thing. And it is smaller than you expect, which is why it works. Before you say the words, before its spine forms in your throat and exits as if you chose it, ask yourself one question, not out loud, not to them, just inside, where you are honest, if you are honest anywhere. Where is this coming from? Not what happened. Not what happened is not what the right thing to do is. Only is this coming from strength or from fear? That is the entire diagnostic. Strength means you have actually processed what happened. You have decided this relationship is worth more than this grievance. You are releasing it from a place that costs you nothing, because you are whole, and this genuinely does not diminish you. Fear means the calculation ran again. Threat detected. Fawn deployed. And you called the output of that calculation a virtue because it was easier than looking at what it actually was. You do not have to say anything after you answer the question. You do not have to confront anyone or make declarations or perform a clarity you do not yet feel. You do not have to do anything different today. You just have to know, once, honestly, which one it is, because the moment you know, the moment you can feel the actual difference between those two things somewhere below your sternum, you are no longer the person who forgives without knowing why. You are the person who sees the mechanism. And a mechanism you can see is a mechanism you can, eventually, choose not to run.
The mirror still has its cracks. They do not disappear because you named them. This is not that kind of story. There is no version of this where the fractures seal and the reflection becomes clean, and you emerge on the other side as someone for whom none of this is difficult anymore. But you are looking at the edges now, and there is something that happens when you look at a fracture directly. When you stop performing around it and simply see it, the fracture does not grow. It stops being the thing you are organized around avoiding. It becomes just a fact about the mirror. And facts, unlike fears, do not require your constant management. Tell me, what is the last thing you called forgiveness that was actually something else? Not what happened. Not who was wrong. Just, how long have you been carrying it? The mirror does not lie. You do.